There is, supposedly, a crisis abroad in the Protestant community here. Protestants increasingly are portrayed as a people without a culture, or rather, as a people who can only conceive of their culture in terms of what it is not. This is, in part, I would suggest, a crisis of the media's making. If this is the Protestantism you go looking for, this is the Protestantism you'll find. Of course, I would say that. I am, as I'm always being reminded, a Protestant writer.
In fact, I once made a list of the words that I thought best described me. Nowhere did the word Protestant appear. I am, in my own mind, an atheist. But then, this is Northern Ireland. To adapt the old Belfast joke, an atheist, are you? Would that be a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist?
The word Protestant, of course, like the word Catholic, is more than just a description of faith in Northern Ireland. But as though our root was fixed for us at birth, it is supposed to define an entire political and social outlook. According to this two-track vision, there are no points of exchange, no alternatives. But if I am, in any meaningful sense, a Protestant, I am the product of a great number of traditions and influences, many of them now overlooked. If I am, in any meaningful sense, a Protestant, then this is my culture. It is, first and foremost for me, an urban culture. The outside world has tended to view Ulster Protestantism as unremittingly dull. Belfast, capital of the Black North, the only city in Ireland to have undergone an industrial revolution, is Protestantism's perfect setting. The work ethic given architectural form. But there's more to a culture than drama and dance steps. Belfast's port first made it into a town, but textiles turned it into a city. More than a city, the linen capital of the world, no less. Belfast has much to be proud of in the efforts of those early, mostly Protestant industrialists. My own family's involvement in the linen industry, however, like that of most other people's families, Protestant and Catholic, was much closer to the mill floor. Despite the poverty and the harsh conditions, it's hard not to feel that something more than employment was lost when linen and its related industries went into decline. The breakdown of surrounding communities was exacerbated by urban redevelopment. Old traditions, old patterns of life lie buried beneath today's motorways. Near this section of Westlink, Robert McAdam's Soho foundry once employed 250 people. McAdam was not untypical of Belfast's early middle class. He was Presbyterian, he was politically liberal, and he was Irish-speaking. Today, McAdam Hall on the Falls Road stands as one of the few reminders of a lost tradition. A former Presbyterian church, it now contains an Irish language school with 95 pupils.
Anish, a warkish, could you antenna the chalk?
She antenna the chalk na came Celtius.
In a lot of ways, McAdam was the most important figure in the Irish language revival in the 19th century in the whole country. No one else has done as much as he has done. He typified a strong section of the Presbyterian middle class in Belfast who regarded Irish as their language.
Fyrsin Facal Calcius on Far Anders Calcius a common scholar and a subject they had a Kershay and the Knedge.
But McAdam is essentially a hero for the entire Irish language community in Belfast in particular, in Northern Ireland more generally, and throughout the island, because he was such a pivotal and such an important figure, and because he does represent an extraordinarily important strand within the language tradition, and one that at the moment doesn't seem to be known about or acknowledged. Irish was fashionable in Belfast during the first part of McAdam's lifetime. The Lord Mayor's chain in Belfast, the slogan under it is actually written in Irish. Irish was sort of plastered all over the town whenever Queen Victoria came to Belfast in 1848. Céad Míle Fáilte was all over the place. And McAdam had actually invented a number of slogans to be sort of decked out in, sort of in chrysanthemums for Queen Victoria's coming in order to enthuse the, actually reflecting the enthusiasm for both the Irish language and the British Empire that was the typified Belfast at that time.
But it wasn't just the language which Belfast Protestants were interested in. The Belfast Harp Festival of 1792, held in the recently built Assembly Rooms, today's Northern Bank, was the impetus for the most important collection of traditional Irish music then ever undertaken. Much more significant to me, though, is the timing of the festival, 3 days beginning the 11th of July. The important date here is not the one that you might think. The date the organisers had their eye on was the day after the festival ended. It had been arranged to coincide with the 14th of July, the anniversary of the storming of the Bastille. Dissenters in the religious sense, Belfast Protestants were also open to radical currents in the political sphere. It has been said that a list of Belfast reformers and radicals at that time would be, in effect, a roll call of almost all the persons of property in the town. When revolution erupted in France in 1789, Belfast was in the vanguard of those voicing their solidarity.
Generous Irishman, your address, read the 12th of this month, has filled our souls with sentiments of delight. That day, friends and brethren, will arrive when the different parts of the civilized world shall raise together their eloquent voice, which, like that of Belfast, shall assert the rights of the people.
Belfast City Hall has for many years symbolised the conservative intransigence of the unionist psyche, sounding a one-note refrain in a virtual one-party state. No, no, and nothing but no. Completed in 1905, the City Hall replaced the much older White Linen Hall, which contained within it a symbol of that earlier, more radical Protestant tradition, the Linen Hall Library. Out of the tremendous cultural and political flowering of the late 18th century came the Society of United Irishmen. Its constitution, proclaiming the rights of man and the greatest happiness of the greatest number, was drafted by a Belfast Presbyterian, William Drennan.
It's important to say that men like Drennan make us realise that there aren't just two communities within the Irish situation, but there's actually always been a third community, the dissenting tradition, and a radical dissenting tradition. When I was working on my thesis in Drennan, I had 2 years' work in a couple of green boxes, and I was living in Rathcoole at the time, that's where I come from. And the boxes were actually misplaced between the car and the front door of the house that I was living in, and were stolen by teenagers. And I found them a week later, all torn up and written over outside the Baptist church in Rathcoole. It was Drennan's material. It was things like Fenian, no surrender, no Pope here, F the Pope, you know. So obviously the Rathcoole boys had decided that Drennan was a Fenian. The fact that Presbyterians were so much to the forefront of founding this library itself, it puts a lie to the idea of some sort of narrow-minded, uneducated, or very blinkered, unimaginative community, which is often how Protestantism is portrayed, especially in Ireland.
The Linen Hall Library remains to this day a common ground. For 25 years, its political collection has gathered without partiality all the literature from the Northern Irish conflict. Loyalist pamphlets nestling alongside An Phoblacht, the journal of the Republican movement. Sectarianism, rigid two-track thinking, leaves plenty of room for irony. The year that culminated in the ceasefires began with a firebomb attack on the Linen Hall Library by the IRA, the self-proclaimed inheritors of the United Irishmen's mantle. In the resulting fire, several hundred valuable books were destroyed.
An Phoblacht reported the attack in an edition housed like all the other editions in the political collection upstairs. Maybe this was the Provost attempting to go postmodern, terrorist version of the text which deconstructs itself, or maybe not. Maybe it was just the final glimpse of an ideology disappearing up its own backside.
The radicalism of those 18th century Protestants at least is generally recognised, though often only to regret that it disappeared so entirely after the bloody mess of the 1798 rebellion and the Act of Union which followed it, as though an entire tradition died and was buried with Henry Joy McCracken in Clifton Street Cemetery. But this, again, is an oversimplification.
When you begin to look into the history of Irish nationalism, you find it filled with bizarre, interesting, ambiguous, intelligent, imaginative Protestants. Very often those Protestant figures were confused. I mean, people like Alice Milligan, people like Francis Joseph Bigger, and going right back to Wolfe Tone and to Henry Joy McCracken, they are filled with confusion and tension. And there's nothing wrong with that, because out of that comes an amazing productivity of ideas and commitment.
Much of the radicalism of subsequent generations has not been so much invisible as overlooked. John Hewitt was the first writer I ever saw. His house in Stockman's Lane was less than a mile from Finicky, where I grew up. I knew Hewitt from school as a poet, but it was not until much later that I became aware of his reputation as a political activist, or more particularly, and more importantly for me, a socialist.
There is, I think, in the north of Ireland, certainly a very distinctive Protestant culture, a frame of mind. And Hewitt in this century represents and was the most significant and the most consistent exponent of a strand within that culture, which was the strand of radical dissent. Now, that came up against a great problem in the late 19th century with the founding of the Unionist Party. And then the ideology of unionism set in. And basically that now is what people think about when they talk about Protestantism, where Protestantism becomes a synonym for unionist, loyalist, reactionary, and all the other nasty terms that you want to think about. And really, in the midst of that, Hewitt stands as an open-minded, generous, tolerant figure.
John Hewitt is a reminder that even after partition there remained oppositional voices from within the Protestant community, that there was both a culture of dissent in the new Northern Ireland and a cultural output arising from it. A reminder, yet again, that orange is not the only colour in the Protestant spectrum. Hewitt had a great love of the Northern Irish countryside, the glens of Antrim in particular. The coastline here tells a potted history of this northeast corner of Ireland. From Garran Point above Glenarm, Scotland is clearly visible, a constant reminder of the sea traffic which has flourished here for centuries. The Celts had a fort here, the Danes landed, then the Normans. In the mid-19th century, Lady Londonderry, great-grandmother of Winston Churchill, built a residence on the point. On her death, the mansion became a hotel for a while, and in 1951 was bought by the Catholic Church and opened as a school named for a Celtic saint, St. McNeese. Since 1988, St. McNeese's has been the location for the John Hewitt International Summer School. History is not so much a march as a meander. It proceeds at a human pace. Individuals can make an imprint.
You've all got a copy of Snow, the poem, the lyric Snow, in front of you. And I'd like just to begin by telling you something of the genesis of the poem. It was written in the winter, in January of 1935, and McNeese's recorded something. He's told us something about how it came to be written. He found himself at that time in the bishop's residence.
Hewitt's importance for me will always be as a dissenter rather than as a writer. The first writer I ever read at school who made me want to write was another poet, another Belfast Protestant, Louis McNeese. The room was suddenly rich, and the great bay window was spawning snow and pink roses against it. Soundlessly collateral and incompatible, world is suddener than we fancy it. World is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. I peel and portion a tangerine and spit the pips and feel the drunkenness of things being various. And the fire flames with a bubbling sound, for world is more spiteful and gay than one supposes. On the tongue, on the eyes, on the ears, in the palms of one's hands, there is more than glass between the snow and the huge roses.
I think in McNeese's poetry and his own attention to language and imagery is always trying to give you the colours of the spectrum rather than the black and white readings. But this is a philosophical as well as a political matter. McNeese believed in a sort of flux and change and the need for the writer to respond very sensitively, to the historical moment. He wrote really the great poem of the 1930s, Autumn Journal, which is entirely about a moment of historical change and how the imagination copes with those pressures. Perhaps in that respect he's been influential with regard to poetry from Northern Ireland, which has had to deal with kind of very, very complex historical circumstances over the last 25 years.
Louis McNeese's Snow has taken on the character of a mantra for me, a caution against oversimplistic definitions. It's for this reason that I feel uncomfortable with notions of Protestant or Catholic culture. No group, no religion, no individual is without contradiction.
I'm free to be whatever I choose, and I'll sing the blues.
Hi, welcome to Belfast.
I'm free to say whatever.
What use are notions of Protestant or Catholic culture here?
If it's wrong or right, it's alright. Always seems to me.
Edna Longley has said that rather than start up a new literary or political clock, we should first try to tell the time accurately. It's hard sometimes to know exactly what time it is in Belfast. They don't build bars here anymore. They build spirit grocers, general merchants. This is a world of carefully constructed nostalgia. The theme here seems to be an uncontentious past, when Guinness was good for you and a pound of sugar was a pound of sugar in anybody's language. Perhaps with violence so recently ended, drinkers here could be forgiven for taking refuge in a shared present based on a non-existent past. In this bar, though, a couple of months back, I was being interviewed for television. The barman approached the interviewer and asked him when the programme was being broadcast. The interviewer explained apologetically that it was for German television. The barman said he could pick up German TV on satellite. "You don't understand," the interviewer said. "It's for German regional television." The barman began reeling off the names of the German regional channels. The interviewer stopped him when he reached the right one. "That's okay then," the barman said. "I can get that one too. I'll set the video." If culture has no religion, it increasingly has no single nationality. Or perhaps increasingly is wrong. Perhaps culture has always adapted, absorbing new influences. The word itself contains that vital sense of growth. Culturally, whether we care to admit it or not, we are as British and American as we are Irish. But what's the problem with this? Culturally, the British are more Irish than they either know or will admit. I said at the beginning of this programme that I have no sense of myself as Protestant. I do, though, have a sense of Northern Irishness, of which I'm proud. Northern Irishness, that is, free from any political or constitutional absolutes. Northern Irishness in the way that I once had a sense of Northern Englishness when I lived in Manchester. A culture, if it's anything, is based on shared experience. A culture, for me, finally, is what we live right here, right now.